So as an introduction for those of you who don't know Paul, he's joining us from the UW Extension Lakes program at UW Stevens Point, and he'll be talking about invasive aquatic plants.
Okay, thanks, Anne. So I intend to cover 4 species today, the first being Starry Stonewort, which is a large algae that you may have heard of. It showed up a couple years ago in Wisconsin in the southeast. And then European frog-bit is a species that we don't yet have in Wisconsin. Hopefully we never get it, but it is knocking on the door. And then the final 2, I sort of debated putting these in here or not. They are prohibited species, but they are subtropical species that are Zone 8, Zone 9 species that are not expected to survive winters anywhere near here, but we have been finding them in many locations across the state the last few years, including consecutive years in some cases in the same location. So let's start with Starry Stonewort. Again, this is an algae. It's not a vascular plant, although it can grow to over 2 meters tall. So it's easily confused with other aquatic vascular species. Just a couple of shots of the populations here. This is one from out in New York. You can see it forming a thick mat across the bottom and crowding out some other native species. In Wisconsin, we first found it in Little Muskego Lake in Waukesha County in the fall of 2014. And in 2015, we were up to 4 populations, again, still in the southeast. And then last year it showed up in Door County. The populations in Door County, from what I understand, are pretty well established, so it's not likely that it actually moved there last year. It was just discovered there last year when somebody happened to be looking. So we now have 9 water bodies across the state that are confirmed to have Starry Stonewort. There's also 9 in Minnesota. They received their first population, or detected their first population, in 2015 with over 250 acres of Starry Stonewort discovered in that lake. So obviously that was not the first year for that population either. And last year they found 8 additional populations as far north as Bemidji. This is a species that's native to Europe, and strangely enough, it is an endangered species in Europe. There are not many locations over there, and it tends to be very responsive to habitat degradation. So only pretty pristine habitats still have it over there, and anything that's been impacted by development or nutrient pollution and things like that tend to lose their Starry Stonewort. Unfortunately, it does very well here, and disturbance certainly doesn't bother it here. It was first identified in the early 1970s in the St. Lawrence River in New York. Has been spreading throughout Lake Erie and Lake Ontario until about the mid-1980s. It started showing up in the Detroit area, in Lake St. Clair, and western Lake Erie. And then in the late 90s or early 2000s, it started to show up in inland lakes of Michigan, and again made it over to Wisconsin, or was detected here anyway in 2014. This species belongs to a family called the Caraceae. This is a large group of large algae that occur in Wisconsin lakes. There's a couple dozen species of them. All of them are native except this particular one. And typically those species prefer specific depth ranges. Many of them will only be in the first foot or so of depth in a lake system. Some of them prefer 1 to maybe 5 or 6 feet, and so on. There's other depth gradients that they prefer. And the Nitellopsis, the Starry Stonewort, has been found in anywhere from inches of water down to 7 or 8 meters of depth. So it doesn't seem to have a real strong preference one way or the other. And unfortunately, the management efforts that have been tried on this across the region have mostly been unsuccessful. We've been trying different management techniques across Wisconsin's populations, and none of them really have shown too much promise to this point. Michigan has been doing a lot of herbicide treatments with various herbicides, including combining vascular plant herbicides with algicides, and either way, the results have not been very good. So they often have to repeat treatments many times throughout a year to keep it down. This species spreads by fragments and by these little structures that are called bulbils. They're little starch reserves on the plant, similar to a little potato, except these are only about 8 millimeters across. And you can see in the right shot there, that's a clump of Starry Stonewort that I pulled up. Again, this is another shot from New York. But you can see all the little white bulbils all over underneath the plant. So that was pulled out of the sediments. And on the left, you can see why it's called Starry Stonewort. This family in general is often covered with a crust of minerals and lime deposits. So that's where the stonewort part comes from, and the starry part, obviously, from the bulbil shape. Interestingly, even though this has been in the U.S. for 4 decades or so, there's never been a female discovered in North America. So as far as we can tell, it was a male or a number of males that were introduced into the Great Lakes, probably by ballast water, and they have been cloning themselves through fragmentation and through bulbils since then. There may very well be females out there, but again, in the last 4 decades, nobody has documented a female. So if that's the case, since this is a species that has separate male and female plants, there is no sexual reproduction going on, and therefore it can only spread by fragmentation of the plant itself or by these bulbils. It's not being consumed by waterfowl consuming the seeds of the plant and depositing them somewhere else. It's most likely by fragments getting caught up on boat trailers or anchors or things like that. We kind of covered that already. The picture that you see is a bulbil laying on the bottom of a lake. There is one other species of macroalgae in Wisconsin that produces bulbils, which is Cara aspera, the rough stonewort. And this is one of those species that typically is growing in less than a foot of water. It's usually on very shallow, sandy shorelines. And although it does produce bulbils, the bulbils are basically spherical. They certainly aren't star-shaped at all, so they shouldn't be confused with each other. One of the first things to notice with the starry stonewort is that it is much larger than the other macroalgae of the region. Typically, they're about the diameter of a nickel, or maybe even a little smaller. And starry stonewort can be 4 or 5 inches in diameter, so it's very, very large compared to the others. It also holds its shape very well out of water, which is in contrast to many of the native species. If you find something that you know is a macro alga rather than a vascular plant in a lake, it's most likely in this family. And the first thing to look for is whether the stem has these long cells running up and down the stem. If it does, it's in the genus Cara, which is all the species of Cara in Wisconsin are native. So that's an indication that is definitely not starry stonewort. Starry stonewort's stem would be perfectly smooth and bright green. We do have a Starry Stonewort Clearinghouse on our Extension Lakes website, where we have a bunch of different resources available to help people understand and identify this species. So there are a couple of fact sheets, and we put together an identification video that compares it to some other native lookalike species. If you're interested, you can go to the website that you see on the screen there and click on the Citizen Lake Monitoring Network button or on the sidebar, and then Aquatic Invasive Species. The next one I'll cover is European frog-bit. Again, this is not in Wisconsin yet. It's native to Europe and Asia, known from some of the eastern states and in Ontario as well. This is a floating species. It forms a little raft of interconnected leaves that form from a rosette and spreads mostly by stolons right under the surface. So you'll find stolons radiating in 4 directions from the parent plant, and you'll end up with these little webs of leaves floating across the surface. They look kind of like very small lily pads, except the leaves are typically only about 2 inches or 3 inches across. And underneath, you'd see a bunch of fibrous roots. So these are floating plants that are absorbing nutrients directly from the water column rather than from the sediments. And underneath the leaf, it has these very large air cells, which are designed to just keep the plant floating to aid with buoyancy. So if you flipped it over, you would feel this very thick airy portion of the leaf, right where the leaf stem or leaf stalk or the petiole attaches to the leaf. When you see it flower, if you see it flower, it only has a single flower that's held about an inch or two above the water. Obviously much different than a white water lily, which you might be familiar with. That would be much, much larger and have way more petals. This only has 3 petals and a yellow center. Maybe PJ knows what that bug is on there, I'm not sure. The next couple I'll talk about, again, these are subtropical species that are not thought to overwinter here, although we have been finding them at many locations across the state for many years. The water hyacinth is a native to South America and was brought to a cotton event in 1884 and essentially given away as a door prize because it was such a fantastic plant. They just had to give it away to lots of people that were at this event. So it started spreading from there as people went home and released it into local water bodies. It's considered a zone 9 to 11 species, so zone 9 is a minimum temperature of 20 degrees Fahrenheit, which we obviously get way below in Wisconsin. So according to that, it should not survive a winter in Wisconsin. Although we've been finding it repeatedly at certain locations across Wisconsin, and that's concerns some people. So it is considered a prohibited species in Wisconsin, which means that it's illegal to sell, transfer, or possess. And you can actually be forced to remove it from your property if you don't cooperate. So it's considered a serious pest. Here's just a couple of shots of it. You can see that it forms a floating rosette again. On the lower right picture, you can see all the roots hanging down underneath. The large glossy leaves are very waxy and they stand quite vertical, so they function as sort of these sails on the plant. And that helps it to break up into small colonies that would drift around and spread itself locally. There's a couple of shots from Lake Winneconne in Winnebago County. The last 2 years, water hyacinth has been found in Lake Winneconne in the same area, and there's some reports that it may have actually been spotted in a similar area many years ago by a fisherman. So again, it's not thought to overwinter here, but there's some concern that maybe it's producing seed that's surviving the winter, or somehow it is able to come back year after year. We often find these species next to roads and culverts where people can easily dump water garden species. So being in these invasive species, they are commonly used for water gardens and fill up the water garden very quickly. So people often will thin them out and dispose of them somewhere like a local ditch or a lake or river where there's a quick access point. So you can see that was certainly the case here. This is a shot of the Mississippi River at Pool 5 near Alma and Buffalo City back in 2013. Again, this was found 2 years in a row in this location, and you can see how dense the water hyacinth and also the water lettuce here, the paler green leaves or water lettuce, they both got to pretty extreme densities in that location. So the last one I'll cover is water lettuce. You just saw it again in the Mississippi on the previous slide. This is another floating species that spreads by stolons, so it has these under subsurface stems that spread in 4 directions and connect little daughter plants or clones. And it's a very, very lightweight species. It's mostly air cells within those leaves, so it floats very high. And also is one of these species with the fibrous roots that dangle underneath. And in this species, several feet underneath. So here it is mixed with the water hyacinth again. You can see the dark green glossy leaves of the hyacinth in the center surrounded by the water lettuce. This actually really does look like a head of lettuce or cabbage floating on the water. And typically in Wisconsin you might see it growing to 5 or 6 inches tall, although in tropical climates you might see it at several feet tall. So if you think you've found any of these species or find anything that you feel is suspicious, the proper person to contact would be a regional DNR lakes biologist. And you can find that by just going to the DNR website and searching lake biologist. Or if you are having trouble with that, just contact me. My contact information is there at the bottom of the slide, and I can get you to the right person.